we've talked for the last day or so about prevention, and now we're moving into preparedness and response. And so our point of entry today is all of those barriers to prevention that John talked about yesterday have failed, and we're now dealing with an incident. And these things don't happen often, but when they do happen, they can be very significant. And so the point of preparedness is to be as ready as we possibly can to try to lessen and mitigate the adverse impacts when a spill does happen. So I was invited here today primarily because of a series of studies that I did for the province, for the Ministry of Environment 2 years ago. I want to be able to read that, where we talked about world-class prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And does the phrase world-class make everyone in this room cringe at this point? It makes me cringe. Because I think it's a phrase that's been thrown around and politicized. And so what I want to think about today when we talk about world-class is, it's an aspiration. It embodies the desire to do the best that we possibly can. And so I want to kind of get that out there and acknowledge that it's a loaded term. So today we're here to learn from the CIMASURE and from the collective past experience of everyone in the room. I'm going to try to share some of my experience and my history working in and around these issues. Talking a little bit about preparedness for future incidents. It's always important to remember that we're not going to have the same incident we just had again. We're going to have a different incident. In trying to pull this together, I'm aware that I'm talking about our 2-year-old report that probably most of us have read. And so I tried to kind of zoom up a little bit and think about it thematically. And so I'm going to share some common themes that I think carry through the specific topics that I'll talk about. And then I will work through those world-class elements from the report. I'm going to do it in kind of a vignette style. I won't go into tedious detail, but my idea is that I want to kind of set the table for the discussions that we'll all have after this talk. So we're obviously here because of an incident that you had that fortunately it ended well. It didn't result in an incident. And as I started to prepare for this talk, I thought that I would be using the CIMASURE as a kind of a what if and sort of trying to draw you down. Well, if it had gone on the rocks, what would we be thinking about? But certainly the incident got everybody focused on the risks. The risks are there. Very ironically, I've been working with the City of Vancouver and some of the First Nations in that area over the last year or so on their preparedness for oil spills, and got a phone call a little over a month ago from someone in the emergency management department at the city saying we've had a small spill in English Bay. And so I spent a week or so working in the Unified Command as a technical advisor for the city and for the Tsleil-Waututh during that incident. And so it certainly helped to ground truth some of what I'm talking about. It brought some of it kind of fresher in my mind, and I think it sort of informed some of these themes that I'm going to talk about. And Randy and I had this conversation. We worked together 10 years ago in the Aleutian Islands on a spill. And the issues are not new. They're not earth-shattering. We seem to come back and bump our heads against these same things time and time again. And if there's anything that I think we can get out of convening all of these people with so much knowledge and experience, it's to try to find ways to get past those and make some change. So I'm going to talk about 3 themes. The first one, we're working, First Nations are the ultimate locals. You were literally the first people. But any oil spill on any coastline is impacting people who were there before the spill and who were there after the spill. And there's lots of different levels of involvement in a spill, but the locals are there and they're impacted, and they're much more than a stakeholder. So we're going to talk about locals through this entire conversation. But I'm also going to talk about planning, the importance of planning. A lot of what I'll talk about is work that's done in the planning realm that you can bring to the table at an emergency that can hopefully help you to be more successful. And then I'm going to talk about logistics and the importance of thinking not just what are your strategies and tactics, but how are you going to do those? And particularly in places like this where we're more remote, where we've got rugged geography, you've really got to focus down at that granular logistics level. So this first quote is from Thad Allen. He's a retired Coast Guard admiral in the U.S. He was our national incident commander in the Deepwater Horizon spill. I'm sure some of the people in the room have met or heard Thad speak. I was at an event with him back in the fall where we were looking at lessons learned 25 years after the Exxon Valdez and almost 5 years after the Deepwater Horizon well blowout. And it struck me that Admiral Allen, who is an amazing speaker, he's larger than life, he can, enrapture an audience, who was the highest person in the United States overseeing that response, talked almost exclusively about the locals. He talked about parish presidents, he talked about the governors, he talked about the town hall meetings, and he talked about how this enormous spill was really a lot of big spills, and that how much we had underestimated the importance of really communicating and working at that level. So Chad threw me a nice compliment this morning. I'll say that one of the things you said yesterday about building the foundation, that locals are the foundation. You can plan from the top down or you can plan from the bottom up, but you can't build a foundation from the top. So that's what I'll say. I never read my slides, but there are pictures and words if you want to think about what I was thinking when I wrote them. So the next one, now I've got another military quote by President Eisenhower, and many of us who work in planning use this all the time, but we talk about planning, there are the plans and there's the process. And they're both important, but if I had to pick one, I'd pick the process, because when you write plans, you're divorced from the incident, you're in a separate, safe space where you can talk about things. You don't have the pressure cooker there that is an incident command post or an emergency response context. It's very hard to make decisions in an emergency. It's even harder to make friends. So if you can have those hard conversations and work through things away from the pressure of there's a ship drifting toward the rocks or there's oil coming at us, you typically are going to get a more rational, well thought out product. And another military quote, and this one is about logistics. And the graphic I have up there probably needs some explaining, and it's inspired by, I've had a lot of really great mentors in my career, and one of them was Larry Dietrich, who was the director of spill prevention and response for the state of Alaska for many years. Larry's a challenging but brilliant person. And he retired recently after a long and very productive career in Alaska, where he was really the driving force behind a lot of what's in place there now in terms of regulation and practice that has been called time and again world class. And so one of the last projects that we did for Larry, but before his retirement, was this nearshore operations response strategy project. And it was like all things you get into with Larry, you save your first draft because you start here and you end up kind of going back there. But his concern was in the face of increasing activity in the U.S. Arctic Ocean. So this was a couple years before Shell was going out for the first time to drill in the Chukchi Sea. How on earth are we going to do a spill cleanup if we need to do that in the U.S. Arctic Ocean? You've got, small population centers with no road system. You've got small airstrips. You've got almost no deep draft ports. What would you have to do to really mount a response? And not just the skimmer and the booms, but the people, and where are the people going to sleep, and who's going to feed them, and where are they going to use the bathroom? And so what he kind of came up with was we started calling the cooks and bottle washers plan, which was he wanted us to work through, and we did this in a kind of a collective work group environment with some of the response organizations and government and locals, and looked at what would you really need to do if you had to take a whole, put a whole major spill response in a remote location. So we came up with these logistics bases, and there's a whole plan under it that I'd be glad to share. But I need to move into my actual world-class elements. So this is the study. I'm going to talk about the third volume where we kind of put together some characteristics or elements of world-class, which I'll talk through at a high level today. I'm kind of trying to take my whole world of knowledge and synthesize it into a few slides. But this is from the report. I doubt that you can read that, but there is a great summary in the discussion guide that the Copper Moon folks put together. So that has the elements, and you can easily find the whole long report online. And when we looked at this world-class concept, we started with prevention, we worked through preparedness and response, and then system elements. We covered prevention yesterday, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to focus on these kind of elements of preparedness, and then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about the system elements. So the first one is geographic areas, and we've already talked quite a bit about GRPs, geographic response plans, or strategies, GRSs. They're called different things in different places. There's other concepts that are geographically specific about how we plan for oil spills. I took home last night the HIDA Marine Plan and flipped through it a little bit. And we talk about doing geographic specific planning for whatever purpose. You start with an inventory, you move to prioritization, and then you come up with your tactics. And I think that what I saw in the plan was those first two steps. You've got an inventory and you've done some prioritization. So that's great foundational work. Now you just have to come up with what you're going to do tactically there. So here is one geographic response strategy from Alaska. I pulled this one because it's from the Aleutian Islands, and we talked a lot yesterday about vessels in innocent passage and the challenges of planning for spills from vessels that may not have any obligation under your regulatory regime. The Aleutian Islands has a lot of those same issues, and in fact, it's a lot of the same vessels that are coming by Haida Gwaii that are then going through Unamak Pass and out to Asia. So I just chose this randomly. And there's a lot of different ways to do GRSs or GRPs. These are from Alaska. I've worked on different formats on the East Coast. I've done some in Australia. And there's no right or wrong way. The important things, are to get a tactics, language, some standard symbology so that responders know what they're supposed to be doing. It's great if you can tie those to actual tactics. So is this a pointer? No. So on the left there, you actually see some explanation of what you're meant to be doing with those symbols. But going back to my all oil spills are local thing, the value, I think, in developing GRPs and GRSs is that process. And so, I've seen GRPs that have been done in a cubicle, and I've seen GRPs that have been done in a work group. And the latter are much more painful to do, but typically much better socialized. And when a spill happens, they've got to be accessible and tangible to the people that are going to be implementing them. So my point on GRPs and GRSs is there's lots of good ways to do them. You just have to do them. So my understanding, and I think Chris, I don't know where you're sitting, gave me this, I have terrible vision, gave me this from the Simasher. And so it looks like during that incident, you actually did do some prioritization and some thinking about protective booming. And that's great. And just to my point about planning, doing it ahead of time makes it that much easier to operationalize your plan and to start to figure out what do we need to do, where are we going to put the boom first, how much time do we have to do it. But it's great and very forward-leaning to have done that in the heat of an incident that never even actually resulted in prevention or pollution. So that's good for you. And this is a potential places of refuge plan. I think that was more of the discussion yesterday, but same thing. We've done these all over in Alaska, and we do them with a process, with an inclusive process, because as Jacob or Russ mentioned, is it a sacrifice, or is it a refuge? You got to have those conversations when there's not a ship kind of steaming towards your coastline or drifting. And I just, to the point about logistics, here's what the backside of one of those PPR plans looks like in Alaska. And so we do everything from stakeholder maps. So here are the stakeholders who probably you're going to want to reach out to before you tow a stricken vessel into this anchorage. And then here's your logistics piece, information about what the anchorage is, about where it's located, about what kind of services are available. So you really are doing those plans on two levels. You're doing them, on an environmental level and on a logistical or tactical level. So then contingency planning, let's zoom up a little bit and talk about just contingency planning as a whole. I think geographic response plans are great, but they're not the whole plan. They're one protective booming tactical element of a much larger comprehensive planning. And again, I'm going to say process is everything. Inclusive planning where you start to have some shared understanding is very valuable. You need ingredients, and here's a nice laundry list of the typical things that are put in contingency plans. I've worked with Mark's organization since 1997 on Prince William Sound Tanker Plan reviews and watching the evolution of that, and have written and reviewed hundreds and hundreds of contingency plans over the years. And it's not rocket science. There's some kind of basic standard things that we put in all of them, and there's lots of great international guidance out there on how to do it. But you need to really address all of these things, from what do you do when the call comes in to how do you decide that a beach is clean enough. And going to process here, this is a page out of the Northwest Area Contingency Plan. So in the U.S., we kind of have two levels of planning. We have government planning, and that's really done government inclusive of industry and inclusive of all levels of jurisdiction. And then we have industry plans, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But this is what would be our kind of area plan. You've talked about doing them. And I think, to me, the point of this slide is on the right-hand side, you see the membership of the Northwest Area Committee. This is a group. I'm not sure how often they meet. The area committee that I participate in meets 3 times a year. And we have everyone from the tribal governments to the state agencies, to the local governments, to the federal agencies, and we come together and we work on the plans. The plans are evergreen and works in progress. We share experiences. We talk about recent incidents. It's an ongoing forum, and it's messy. There's a lot of organizations and a lot of names. There's subcommittees. But it's a process, and the Northwest Area Contingency Plan I chose because it's a close neighbor, but also because it's widely accepted as one of the best and most robust systems in the U.S. But there's also the industry side, and we talked a little bit yesterday about the Symasure and about the fact that there was a plan in place. So they had a contract with Gallagher, so that that call happened, and that plan was under the U.S. regs, and we have a pretty, the system varies a little bit by region across the U.S., but after the Exxon Valdez spill, when they finally passed our Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which actually had been kicking around our Congress for about 15 years before that, it involved a rule for these vessel response plans and created a whole component of our Coast Guard that oversees that. And so we have regulations that set out any vessel over carrying a certain amount of oil and coming in and out of U.S. ports has to create one of these plans. They have to submit it to our Coast Guard. There's a 5-year review cycle, and it has to have some standardized components. And one of the big ones is this kind of planning standard. So we establish planning standards based on the vessel, and there's a formula based on how much oil the vessel carries and where it's operating, what kind of equipment it needs to have access to, and how quickly that equipment needs to be based on where it's operating. There's requirements that they exercise these plans. There's requirement that people with different roles identified in the plan are trained. So that's kind of the federal level, and I'm talking about tank vessels. About, I think around 2008, we sort of caught up in the U.S. with the fact that tankers aren't the only things that spill oil. So we put in place a set of non-tank vessel regulations, and it took forever. I think the NAVIC, the individual instruction from the Coast Guard came out in maybe 2008, and the regs finally got on the books in 2013. This stuff doesn't happen quickly, but it did happen. And so now we have a very similar, almost a parallel structure for non-tank vessels who are accountable for planning for potential spills from their bunkers, just like tankers would be from their cargo. And so that's a federal process. It's done pretty much implemented by the Coast Guard with not too much outside involvement. But then in a lot of our states, like Alaska and Washington, we have these state-level contingency plans. And I know another level of planning and compliance. And those plans typically go out for public review. So now you've got an extra burden to industry for sure, but you've also got a plan that the public gets to see before a vessel starts transiting through and comment on. Chad and I have reviewed and commented on plans. Mark and I have done that for years. Again, it's a process, and it's extra work, but it's also extra level of preparedness and feeling like if something goes bad, we've done all that we possibly can. So going to the equipment piece now, you obviously need to have enough equipment available to clean up a spill or to contain a spill or to whatever level is either established in regulation or considered appropriate standard of care. And you need to position the equipment so that it can get where it needs to be within the amount of time. Oil spill response is always a race against the clock. As oil gets on water and it spreads, your opportunity to contain it and recover it or disperse it or burn it diminish very rapidly with time. This is a map from our report. I'm certain outdated, and I'm sure Kevin can speak to this much better in the discussion groups than I, but it's nice to have a sense for where equipment is, what's in the inventory. You have, I think, Coast Guard-owned equipment and contracted equipment. I think operators probably around the port area also have their own equipment. I'm not sure, probably in Rupert as well. But the point of the slide is knowing where the equipment is half the battle sometimes. And this is a very very gross schematic here. But so where your equipment is. How do you figure out if you have enough equipment? Well, again, sometimes that's a regulatory decision. Sometimes that's a planning decision. That's really a tolerance decision. There's no right or wrong answer to that. But I think it is important to think about what can you do with the equipment you have. And there are a lot of different ways to do that can be very complex models. There's also very simple ways to think about, if the entire Symashore had lost all of its bunkers. I've read that there were 400 tons on board. We'll call that a ballparkly correct. So the first thing you got to do is circle the vessel with boom. And this is a 135-meter vessel. We multiply that by 3. That's your rule of thumb for how much boom. So you've used 405 meters to encircle your ship. And so now, what else do you have? How quickly can you get it here? What are your priorities going to be? You're probably first going to try to get stuff out on the water to try to do some free oil recovery. You may want to be getting some boom out for protectives. So we actually go through a process where we work through all these things. We tally up boom. We look at recovery capacity of skimmers. It's tedious, but it's not it's not impossible. And understand what your capacity is. Again, you're never going to have everybody, I think, understands that you can't have huge warehouses of boom stationed along the entire coast, but you can think strategically about where they are and about what the timing and logistics would be to cascade resources in, and is there enough time to affect the use of those resources. And so you need equipment, and you also need people to operate it. And there are a lot of people, going back to Larry Dietrich and his cooks and bottle washers, there are a lot of people that have to show up when there's a big spill. There were thousands of people at Deepwater, right? I mean, you're not going to have a well blowout here. But you could still easily get into the hundreds and the thousands for a major marine response. You have people cleaning beaches. You have people doing on-water recovery. You have wildlife responders. You have people managing the waste stream. You have people in the command post. And then you have those salvers. Okay, 10 minutes. That's good. I'm actually in good shape. That's a photograph from the Salandang IU, and the salvers there. I mean, it was a spill in a fairly small location. We all stayed in the same hotel. We all worked out of the same command post. We all got to know one another. And there was this team of salvers there from Sweden. And these guys were they walked on water. I mean, what they did to get the fuel off that vessel was just amazing. And we all sat around and go, you're going to do what? You're going to sling load cubes from a helicopter, load them onto the deck of this vessel that's broken in half and is teetering on the rocks in the Aleutian Islands, and you're going to lighter off the fuel, and you're going to sling load it out, and you're going to do that without hurting anybody or spilling anything? And they did. So, but that takes people, and that takes very skilled people, and there's probably a half dozen people in the world that have that particular skill set. And they never paid for a drink the entire time, those guys. So then when everything's done and you've had your response and it's hopefully been as successful as it can be, there's the recovery piece. And we're going to bring the locals back in now, because now we've all flown in from Houston and Vancouver and London, and we've all had a role in the emergency, and now it's putting the pieces back together. And we know from past spills that recovery is not a black and white process. There's not a day when you say, okay, we're all back to normal. And it's very perspective driven. It's very contentious, and it's very complicated. We don't necessarily understand the science of it. And there's also a culture to it. But, the Exxon Valdez, these are pictures from 2012. There are still beaches. There aren't many, but there are still a few beaches where ground zero, where that spill, where you can dig a pit and you can get a sheening oil. And so that, there are lingering impacts. This is a photo from the Gulf spill, and this is, obviously the perspective of many of the locals who rely on the Gulf of Mexico for seafood and for their culture and their well-being. They saw that spill as a big death event. What didn't kill every shrimp in the Gulf, but it felt like that to some people. And so this recovery piece is very multifaceted and very challenging. And you can do a lot of things. You can restore ecosystems, but it's not something that you can kind of make up on the fly. It takes some time and some thought. I was in the group yesterday that talked about oversight and assessment and transparency, and I think many of you in this room are government, and I want to make the point that's probably clear to everyone, which is there's trust issues when oil spills happen. Transparency is not always the first thought of people who are responding to an incident, not because you're hiding something, because you're just working so hard on what's in front of you. You've got tunnel vision. But transparency, and I Googled oil spill conspiracy, and I got the Deepwater well and then a UFO. So somebody has thought that at some point, or made a graphic about it. And the bottom one's more obvious, but you get protests. It's a charged atmosphere. So whatever you can do in the light of day, I can tell you, will help with that local piece. And this is the last Selendang story I'll tell, but I was out there working for the state, and we were doing water quality sampling, and there was a ton of concern from the fishing community. We had the $2 billion Bering Sea pollock fishery starting, and we had 2 crab fisheries going on. And the fleet wanted to know, and the processors wanted to know, what's going to happen? Are we going to get a tarball? This wasn't a deep water spill. It was a 400,000 or so gallon bunker spill, but there were tarballs, and they were lingering, and they were everywhere, and we weren't sure where they were. And so what we ended up doing was some sampling where we towed transects with tow nets, and we did beach walks, and we tried to gather information about observations of oil. And then we presented those at public meetings and said, we don't know exactly where it's going to go, but we observed it in this transect, so maybe, consider that. And just putting that information out there and giving people the opportunity to kind of process it and make their own decisions off of it was very powerful. I mean, that was a tense spill. There was Unalaska is a tight community, but it's a tool. So transparency is works both ways. Continuous improvement, testing. I have a program that I work with. Missing a slide there, in Massachusetts, where we have a whole first strike capability that's tied to our GRPs, and we train firefighters. We have these boom trailers that we've put in 80 communities, and we do these exercises all the time with firefighters and some of our harbor personnel. And so they have the equipment, they have a plan, and they can use the equipment. They can use it if a fishing vessel sinks and has a diesel spill, or they can use it if the big one's coming at them. But you have to. Not everybody can set boom, but you need to practice and learn how to do that. And the final piece is financial. I don't even have a slide for this. I think everyone realizes that all of these things that we've talked about cost money. And I know that you have a polluter pays system here in Canada, and that's great. My experience has been we have a polluter pays system in the US too. The polluter pays, but the polluter's lawyer tries very hard to minimize how much the polluter pays. And so, think about that and there's no easy answer to that. So to wrap up, all oil spills are local. The risks are borne locally. The consequences are dealt with locally. Creating a space at the planning table for local interests, even if you don't have full consensus, even if you have to use your jurisdiction sometimes, having those dialogues like we started today are great, and I'm sure that you'll continue with those. I think a first strike capacity is really important, and that's a great way to use locals. When a spill first happens, you want to contain it at the source. You want to recover as much as you can on water. That's what the incident focuses on. That's what WCMRC does. Protecting places that might not come in contact for hours or days, that's a great place to channel local efforts. Setting boom, protecting resources that they've identified as priorities. Those things can happen simultaneously. Planning is everything, obviously, multi-jurisdictional, cast a wide net. It's cumbersome and frustrating sometimes and tedious, but there's usually worthwhile results at the end. And just having a common process, having aligned expectations, having locals who were there when you picked the GRP sites and realized that even though you wanted to protect everything, you were going to prioritize protecting those three things. Now when you have, the locals are the first point of contact for people who are upset in the public. And when you have someone who can kind of, be an ambassador and say back to their constituents, yeah, I know, but we thought about this and this is what we decided. That's really important. And, cooks to bottle washers, Larry Dietrich, but think about logistics. That's part of why we do exercises and drills. You don't want to find out that there's a coupling missing from your compressor that you're going to use to, to inflate something in the incident. Those little things can be important. You have to start motors for them to keep working. And people that manage equipment and do this all the time know this. But if you're talking about, community capacity and planning, you want to make sure you do that. So it occurs to me it's all about balance. We're all here in this room today trying to balance interests and priorities. And again, I just want to thank the HIDA for bringing everybody here and letting me be part of it. So thank you.